I'm sure this group is very familiar with the K-shaped economy situation. There's the haves and the have-nots, and ever since the 80s, that disparity has gotten just wider and wider and wider. So what I find with older clients, there's ones that the seniors that have the pensions and have the 401ks, and then there's the ones that don't. They're the bottom of the K. With younger people, is folks that are companies that are doing equity offerings or matchings or stronger matches or different cafeteria type things like we'll pay down your student loan. It's kind of the cycle is kind of repeating back into the mid 70s as companies are relearning that if you need employees, you got to compete for them and you got to offer them something other than salary.
So are you telling me that you're starting to have legitimate conversations with clients about, hey, maybe I shouldn't retire in Palm Springs because it's going to be too hot there for me to live, and I should think about Montana instead because it's further away from the equator, it's a lot cooler climate? Like, are you starting to have conversations like that with your clients?
I've been starting this several years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Welcome everybody to Inside the Flows. I'm your host, Iyassu, and I am here with founder and principal of Quantum Financial Planning, Tom Nowak. How you doing, Tom?
Very good. Nice to be on your show.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, we were talking about this at the USIF conference, and I was like, you know what, Tom, like let's just bring you on the show. Let's let folks know who you are and what you do, and welcome to episode 18. We've been doing this for a while, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Okay.
So for folks, Tom has been part of the industry and for a number of years, and I met him back at were we calling it the SRI and the Rockies conference?
Probably, yeah.
Man, it's been a while. I'm showing my age here. I have a baby face, but I still have like the gray hairs. And you've been part of the industry and the ins and outs, the ups and downs and whatnot. Yeah. So it's really exciting to have you on here to talk about what you've seen and what you think about where the industry's going and whatnot. But rather than try to describe you myself, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and let them know who you are?
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, my name is Tom Nowak. My firm is Quantum Financial Planning. I'm a career changer. I was a scientist in my first career. I was an analytical chemist for a big pharma company for 30 years. This is my second act, which is about 22 years running now. Opened up an RIA in about 2005 and started as an hourly, and still am, an hourly fee-only fiduciary financial advisor. I took the CFP coursework when I was ending my first career, and I realized that this would be a good second career. And I didn't know, whether it'd be successful or not, so I didn't really plan on it being successful. I was prepared either way. But I was in Northern Illinois most of my adult life, and I moved out to the Washington area right at the start of COVID. I have two daughters. One of them moved out to the Pacific Northwest years ago. Had another daughter on the East Coast, and my wife and I wanted to be closer to one of our daughters, and the one on the West Coast said, come to Whidbey Island, northwest of Seattle. Don't worry the fact that COVID is just starting up and it's going to be a tricky move. But she moved, wanted us to move out here because we have a 5-year-old grandson now, and somebody grandparent duty a couple of days a week. So my part-time job is to be a grandpa a couple of days a week. The rest of the week, I work a lot of Saturdays and Sundays with my clients, and that works really well for them. So it's a full-time job, a lot of second career, they're part-time jobs, things like this. As most advisors would know that run a one-person shop, you can't do part-time. Your fixed costs, are just too enormous. You have to make it a full-time thing in order to make it a business. That being said, it's both business and mission. I do it because I love it. I don't do it because I have to do it. I could retire, but I'm 73 years old, and I told my clients that I'll retire my 80th birthday. I'm going to shut the business down. I'm going to be phasing out over the next 4 to 6 years, and many of them are on board with that. New clients that I add, I let them know right up front that we're going to have to get you squared away or pass you off to another advisor down the road, that kind of thing. My journey to ESG, SRI started around 2010, 2011. You don't know what you don't know till you know it. And I thought, just like most people, that it's just a bunch of extra fees, and you pay more for subtraction. What do you really get? It's everybody's got a different definition. And so I went to a conference to figure out, well, let me find out for myself. I was a scientist in my first career. I still like experimenting. And I figured I'll go to a conference. It was this like SRA in the Rockies conference. And I went there. And the big thing at the time in 2010, I think 2011, was Citizens United. Okay. Corporations are people kind of bill. And I felt, I have a lot of clients, I would have a lot of clients that really don't like companies putting a lot of money into politics. And I felt that, boy, if you have to pay to play, you're probably going to underperform. So that might be a filter. So I went to the SRI and the Rockies conference, and I asked all the different fund managers at the different tables, and this is, do you filter for political accountability? And the answer was no, not yet. They do not. Most of them do now to some extent, but they didn't. So at the end of the day, for some clients, I had to build mini portfolios that would filter based on that. And I wrote a book in 2012 called Low Fee Socially Responsible Investing, essentially creating direct indexing funds that were very concentrated, equally weighted. It was about the same time motif investing started. And, so that was a good fit. Firms like First Affirmative were already doing that kind of thing, 50 stock concentrated portfolios. And then I became a vegan around that time. And in 2014, I realized there weren't any funds that filtered out animal cruelty, meat, or dairy. So I wrote a book called Low Fee Vegan Investing in 2014. And those two books were pivotal because I was just another hourly advisor until that time, and there were people that weren't former chemists, that they were in the industry longer and they would get more traction than I would. But once I created a niche that took off my business, and now the last year I think I served 170 clients, one person shop. So as an hourly advisor, that's pretty much maxed out. So I have like a 3 month waiting list for new clients. I don't advertise. I take myself off any kind of find the planner maps and stuff like that because I don't need the extra phone calls. So that's where I'm at in my business. It's an enviable position for those that are just starting. I wish that would have been the first few years. It wasn't. The first few years are very slow. But it's more, like I said, more mission now, and that's why I do it, and I love doing it because as a former scientist, things like climate change, I never thought I would use my first career near as much as I did, but actually I talk a lot with clients about climate change, and they feel very comfortable knowing that I know what carbon dioxide looks like. So that's kind of my backstory, and I also have a dog that you can see over my shoulder that's taking a nap.
That's cute, cute pup. Yeah, for audience members that are too young to remember Citizens United, what that essentially did was there was a ruling by the Supreme Court that said corporations are allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money as part of their freedom of expression. So dollars can equate to freedom of expression, and what that did was that opened the floodgates to billions and billions of dollars running into the our political system. And the way that corporations would do that is that they would give to a separate party, so a separate entity, I should call it, and that entity would then spend it on for political reasons. And it was that's where the rise of what's called super PACs or political action committees came from. And that really did change the game when it comes to politics. We went from just federal elections at the presidency level, going from maybe a couple $100 million to like tens of billions of dollars to today. So that was a pretty big moment in our political history. And I think at that time, that also created the rise of shareholder resolutions. Where they were, I think it was like Tim Smith actually. He's the one that that really started it. Where there were shareholder resolutions that companies would face that said, report on your political contributions, on an annual level. And so, Tom, you experienced that firsthand. So that was I saw it too. I was like, wow, there's a lot
Yeah.
of money going into politics now.
Yeah, and a shout out to the Center for Political Accountability. Right around that time, even before that, they put together a public database of who gives what to which party, and that type of thing. So you literally could look at that as saying, "Boy, I don't want to invest in this company because they're they're funding things that I don't like, or they're putting a lot of emphasis on that. And then there are other parties that are neutral, nonpartisan, things like that. So it was really nice to have public awareness. So a broad class of investors, you didn't have to have access to a big research department. A whole spectrum of folks could use that data. But it's so much like in our industry. There's others that have taken the torch on so many other things, like filtering out fossil fuels, those kinds of tools, filtering out animal cruelty, those kinds of tools. So it's very good to supplement your other data sources with these very specific ones. And I have my personal reasons why I do that based on the clients that I tend to find and what their needs are, because I think every firm, you kind of start merging your firm towards what clients are tending to be attracted to you. The two become inseparable till they meet, and then it's a straight line going forward. But you kind of shape yourself based on the people that tend to get find you.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And the other thing to think about is, you have like a cap almost on how many clients you can service, right? And
yeah,
I keep telling folks there's so much money to manage in the United States that
yeah,
advisors and wealth managers aren't really competing with each other.
right,
So what ends up happening is you start to get a concentration of the kinds of clients that are attracted to your business and what you provide for them, and then there's a cap. So you're like, okay, like I don't have to do much anymore because I got the best kind of clients that I want, and it serves my purposes, and I'm good here.
yeah. And whether it's a one-person firm or a 10-person firm, or it's the same kind of thing, unless you're a mega firm, then
Yeah.
then it's a different story. But they're the very large firms. I think clients don't identify what their mission is. For instance, I'll use Ameriprise as an example. It's a lot of our, like, it's a franchise, so there are some advisors that might have good conversations with clients that are ESG, SRI related. Others not. Nobody goes to Ameriprise for ESG, or for,
Hmm.
for a certain thing, so it's the smaller firms that are the ones that are allowed to hit the niches, micro niches, and stuff like that, and make a good symbiotic relationships.
Yeah, would you have any advice for some of the next gen wealth advisors who are, maybe 1 year they just got their CFP designation and they're 1 year and they're like just hungry for clients? Do you have any advice for them to kind of grow?
Yeah, yes, I get. I'm a member of the Garrett Planning Network, an organization of hourly fee-only advisors, and to me, it's all about having a niche. If you want to distinguish yourself, especially if you're, a newly minted CFP or relatively new to the industry, like in my case, until I was able to get a certain amount of business just because I was hourly fee only. Hourly fee only was just about taking off. It's still there's still more demand for hourly, than there is, that's left unfilled because there's just not enough capacity. There's not enough people willing to work on an hourly basis because of the scale. You can't get 20, 30 grand per client on an hourly basis. It's just impossible. So there's an unmet need there. But because I was a career changer, that wasn't enough to really take off my business. The ESG SRI, when I focused on ESG SRI, I did it because I wanted to. It just, I didn't do it because, well, this is a great marketing tool. No, it was just a wonderful coincidence. But once I was an hourly ESG advisor, okay, then I would start getting some more clients. once I did the vegan thing, okay, there's only one or two hourly fee only advisors that do vegan financial planning in the United States. I mean, I have clients in 30 different states, so you can get clients very fast that way. The other thing that is kind of hushed a lot in the industry, and for good reason. Not everybody's a career changer that has a pension and a 401k and stuff like this behind them, and is on Medicare and Social Security. I've got some backup, right? So I can keep my fees low. What I find is there's a lot of shaming for somebody that doesn't charge enough. It's kind of, oh no, you're worth more. You should charge what the traffic will bear. You should charge. If you're not getting $300,000-400,000 a year, you're shortchanging yourself. Okay, I get that. I'm not going to shame anybody that wants to make a very, very solid living doing this. Okay, I get that. But for me, if you choose to do a mission and you don't really need a crazy amount of more money, there's a certain benefit of having low cost, because the first person people will ask you when they call you, say, are you still taking new clients? They're going to see what your fee is, and they're going to say, this is a very attractive fee from what I could find, and I have little to lose. So, and the thing is, from my standpoint, it's a lot less stressful if I'm charging $800 an hour. If people are like looking at their wristwatch and looking for golden eggs every 3 seconds, that type of thing. If I'm charging a couple $100 an hour, it's kind of like, okay, I can relax. This is my massage therapist charges the same. I can relax and have a good conversation and what have you. So there's a certain thing. What some advisors do. They'll charge say X amount, and then as they go up and establish themselves, and then they could start increasing their fees above the rate of inflation. If they feel they have the confidence and they don't feel they have any imposter syndrome issues to take care of or anything like that. You just kind of Alan Roth, famous hourly advisor, did that. He started off at 200 or whatever, and then he, as he tells the story at conferences, this is public domain information. He raised by $50 and didn't lose any clients. And then he raised another $50, got more clients. And then he said at 450 or something like that, he said, I don't need any more money. And I think he froze it there 10 years ago, you know, and he has clients that are worth millions of dollars, or even, hundreds of millions of dollars, because he's a niche hourly advisor for very wealthy people that want very simple index funds, so I think his model, is one that a person that really wants to build a business based on a niche could do it. If you want to go right into it as an AUM advisor, ESG advisor, okay, you're competing against a lot of people that have been doing this a long time. You're going to have to fish very hard for those clients to give you that $20,000-30,000 a year commitment. Granted, you only need about 10 of them, so good for you. But the thing is, it's high stress finding those first 10 or 20. So there's just different ways to play it. Different ways to play it.
So what I'm hearing is figure out what that Venn diagram of client demand, like, whether it's
Yeah,
ESG or veganism or climate, and then be very cautious about how you charge those clients, because you
yeah,
can.
yeah,
It's kind of like the grocery store versus the jewelry store, where a grocery
yeah,
store you make money off of volume, for the
yeah,
jewelry store you make volume off of, like, one good sale.
yeah. I mean, there's like advisors that do the chartered divorced analyst type thing, so they focus on divorce clients, or they focus on women clients, they focus on athletes and stuff like that. If you basically go out there and just say, I'll work with anybody, okay, that's okay, but you just have to. Everybody's also competing with you. They don't know who you are. I
Mm.
think that's what it was. It wasn't that when I self-published these books, they weren't going to win any prizes. The fact that I went through the extra effort, told people, okay, you're willing to put yourself out there. Now sometimes you do that through your website. You put yourself out there. As far as if they don't know who you are, then yeah, they're not going to feel as comfortable.
All right, so you young fellas and ladies out there who are
Yeah,
jumping into the
yeah,
investment advisory space,
yeah.
you heard it from Tom Nowak. You got your strategic go to market plan right here.
Yes, there we go.
All right, moving on to our weekly recap. Before we dive in, though, just a quick reminder that these discussions here are for educational purposes only and do not constitute investment advice. And I say it every show: if you need investment advice, just go hire a financial advisor. Like they're really good at what they do. That's the whole purpose of
Yeah.
them. You
So
know,
we have.
I find it hilarious whenever I watch YouTube videos of fin influencers who say the same thing as me, but then they go on and give like 30, 45 minutes of investment advice. I'm like, how is this allowed? But yeah, just go hire a wealth manager or financial advisor. They'll help you out a lot. But yeah, moving on to the weekly recap, Tom. Share some articles with you about some of the highlights that happened this week. And on Monday, Bloomberg wrote that article about institutional pension funds and mega insurers openly modeling climate change events, and I would say like cataclysmic climate. I think they use the word tipping points. Like, what is the tipping point on climate? And I always found that interesting in the asset management space. My old shop, we would call it physical risk, right? When you have an extreme weather event, like what does that do to the portfolio and how do you model it? And it's nice to see that, I've been out of the asset management space for a little bit now and we're still talking about it. So folks still care, but institutional pension funds are a little different and their investment horizon is really long, think 50 years because they got to, pay out their pensioners at some point. And I don't know what using your background, your scientist background, and caring about climate. What did you think about the article and kind of like the notion of, hey, there's some tipping points that we should be concerned about that are coming up pretty quick?
Um, it's yeah, a very yeah, very familiar with the climate space. As a matter of fact, it's a family type concern. Is my wife just flew out yesterday to the annual Citizens Climate Lobby conference where they have 900 people lobby both sides of the aisle to act on climate. The group was partially responsible for getting the Inflation Reduction Act, in place some years ago, working with both sides of the aisle to push it over the goal line and stuff like that. So my wife's a retired scientist, so we're both very concerned. And the one thing that people in the climate space or the aware space know that the only way to keep from getting distressed about it is to do something about it. If you're doing something about it, it's kind of like that movie Don't Look Up, where the meteor is coming.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, if the tipping point comes, those that have been doing something will take our glasses, we'll raise them high and say we did our best. What else can you do? If you do your best, you do your best. It's a little bit like that. You could say that's the case. On the other hand, being a scientist, I'm a financial planner full time in my second career. I was a financial person. Well, when I was a chemist, the first 30 years, I was a serious hobbyist. I just didn't magically just change careers. I had this on my mind for some time. So now I still, at my lunch breaks and stuff like that, I'll usually look at a good video about the latest battery technology, the latest nuclear technology, the latest this. I think even Bill McKibben is at a point now with his third act situation to know that there's certain things we've missed the boat on. The carbon pricing in a gradual way isn't going to solve climate change. It could have done it 10 years ago. We've reached a tipping point. We need Project Hail Mary, for climate. A bunch of Hail Marys, but fortunately, a rosary, if you will, for the Catholics in the crowd, I guess. And, one of those rosies beads is nuclear. One of them is solar. One of them is wind. But you have all these things going forward. Fortunately, the rest of the world, except the United States, is accelerating, in that regard. So the electrification, the balcony solars, all these things together give me hope that we could, like the movie The Martian, we can science the hell out of it. I think he said it a little differently. We could do a lot, at least to minimize some of the worst cases of tipping points. Because one thing that, as a scientist, I knew what was going to happen. Even in the when I first heard about climate change, the first Earth days and all this other kind of stuff, I knew we would. underestimate how soon it would come. It did not surprise me how soon it came. It was supposed to be 2050 or 2100. No, it's here today. That type of thing. If you're out in the Southwest and you're running out of water, you know it. But I also know, I think intuitively, that we over we underestimate some of the positive things that could be done. So I think that's what gives me some hope. But in discussions with clients, I do find that the clients that kind of come to me, we do talk about and have been talking about for years where they should locate and whether it makes sense to move to Florida or Arizona, that type of thing. In a local high school had adult ed programs, and back when I was in Illinois, and an advisor friend, and we did a Social Security one like a couple times a year for a couple hours and stuff. I thought I'd figure, this was about 8 years ago. I did offered a class on personal investing in the age of climate change. This was eight
Mm.
years ago. Okay. I had four people show up, maybe five. It was a very small class. It was a little too early. Now I probably would fill the room. And I did talks at the Garrett conference. I remember the Garrett Planning Network about 5 years ago on science for financial advisors. What is the Keeling curve? What's carbon dioxide? How this is going out of control and stuff like that. So there's a lot of science that advisors should be aware of if they want to be relevant, I guess, to some clients.
So are you telling me that you're starting to have legitimate conversations about with clients about, hey, maybe I shouldn't retire in Palm Springs because it's going to be too hot there for me to live, and I should think about Montana instead because it's further away from the equator, it's a lot cooler climate. Like, are you starting to have conversations like that with your clients?
I've been starting this several years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, I've been having this conversation several years ago. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
It's
no, no.
it's
It's
it's go ahead.
been a while.
It's really fascinating to hear that because if you're starting to have those conversations, I'm sure other folks are too. And the wealth manager advisor, I look at them as like a holistic solution to the client. They're not just thinking about the dollars and cents. They're thinking about everything else, family formation, transfers, all that stuff. And if you're talking about, hey, we're going to hit 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere before 2030, and you should start thinking now about how like how hot your summer is going to be, or how cold your winter is going to be, or how wet your rainy season is going to be. That's pretty, and you're just having that several
Yeah,
years ago. That's pretty shocking.
yeah. No, there's like at least 10 cities in Arizona that are starting to lose significant real estate value because of water situations. And yeah, there's a lot of areas. Have know people in California that have, they had fire damage, which is not solely a climate change thing, but climate change is a magnifier, a force multiplier, that type of thing. And yeah, they've had life changing impacts and stuff like that. But what I have found surprisingly, and it's accelerating with each passing year, is it's not just the portfolio or the tax planning. It's where do I live and whether I rent or buy, because
Mm.
there's a there's a bubble. There's not just an AI bubble. There's still a real estate bubble. If you look at the Case-Shiller index, we're really technically above 2008 valuations, for housing, and so that area has kind of bubbled up too, and so there's a potential for infrastructure issues, that are related to climate, just really wrecking somebody's retirement, that type of thing. So a lot of times is that rent versus buy, because a lot of times people will, they want to be close to their kids or whatever, but the thing is, you could rent a house in Florida or the Southwest or something like that, usually less expensively than you could buy it. So why not just allocate your resources and have a bit of resiliency? So I've had, yeah, I include that as part of my conversations if that's what the client wants. Every client defines what scope they're going to have,
Hmm.
and a lot of folks find that valuable. It just gives them, a lot of times they're thinking along the same lines, but just like in investing, a lot of the do-it-yourselfers, they'll be thinking along the same lines, but boy, do they want to hear from you that you think it's an okay idea to do index investing. They may say, I've read about it, but they need to hear it from a human, not an AI bot. In my opinion, they need to see a person say, yeah, people do this. This is real. You know, Jack Bogle did it.
Yeah,
Warren Buffett is a big fan of it. Don't worry about that. Kind of thing. Yeah.
I do think your point about real estate is pretty interesting because we've talked about this on the show before, where
Mhm.
basically the home builders stopped building at the same volume after the 2008 financial crisis, and there's just all for what is that, 18 years now. There's been a huge lack of housing supply that's not come online, which basically it's a supply and demand thing. If there's not enough houses, then the price goes up. And I think the rent or buy question is a really hard question, because if the housing supply is always constrained, then rent prices are going to go up as well. It's just people can't buy a house and they're going to rent, and then a lot of people want to rent. They're going to price goes up. And I was just on Instagram the other day, and I was watching this video of like almost like a zoning meeting in San Francisco, where there's this really wealthy district called the Marina District, and there's a developer who wants to develop 2 high rises and some more housing units at market rate on top of a Safeway in a very popular area. And the entire neighborhood is just like up in arms, right? They're just like NIMBY, like, not in my backyard. This is super ugly. I've lived here for 30 years and whatnot. But then it's that community in San Francisco and the Bay Area in general is all about eliminating homelessness. And you're like, okay, well, something has to give. Like, you either build more houses, or
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Well,
get more
I've
homeless.
seen you've probably seen a lot of abandoned malls. Retail malls. They're finding they've got the perfect infrastructure for becoming low income housing because you can still have some shops there. So you still keep some of the stores and some of the stove connections and restaurants and stuff like that. But then you build a bunch of bedrooms and bathrooms and you have lower income housing without having to break new asphalt and farmland and stuff like that. So to me, it seemed like a promising solution because, yeah, very few communities. I'm on Whidbey Island and I see, and I was in northern Illinois in a suburban to semi-rural area, so I've seen, NIMBY battles up close and personal, all of my adult life, of all kinds of flavors. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's this is my own personal opinion. It's a perverse incentive with the NIMBYism. It's really they're trying to protect the value of their house that they've spent decades
Yeah.
in, right? And any it doesn't matter if it's low income housing or not. Any kind of additional housing brings that value down, right? Because there's just more units on the
Yeah.
market. So I don't know how you break
Yeah.
that. I mean, somebody has to
Yes.
be very brave and just say, I'm going to be
Yeah.
a one
Yeah.
term
No.
kind of
Yeah.
person and do it.
Yeah.
But anyways, moving on to the midweek. The Wall Street Journal put out a piece on how companies are incentivizing employees to either join them or stay longer by contributing to their 401ks, or just like non-salary based compensation. And that one kind of touches me to the heart, because I really believe in companies doing well for their employees, because the employees are going to do well for their companies. So rather including just having a 401k program, I think they use Costco as like an example, where Costco will give a contribution of 4% of the total pay, or sorry, it's either salary or total pay, in addition to that 401k contribution. And I don't know, Tom, I always think about great places to work and how companies can succeed by creating that great place to work environment for their employees. And it's just like a nice story to read after reading a lot of
Mhm.
like scary things like physical risks and extreme weather events. Do you have does that help you out when your clients work for pretty good corporations or companies that treat them well?
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah. No, I lived through a lot of this. Is in the '70s, when I mid '70s when I started with this big pharma company, we it was a 401k started. The pensions were already in place. and then extra day vacation the following year. Every year around the holidays, it was wonderful for like 6 years. There would be like, oh wow, we got an extra benefit. Oh great, we got that. It was like candy just raining down. That type of thing. It was great until that sector got hit government price controls, and then all of a sudden, look to the right, look to the left, one of you isn't going to be here tomorrow, kind of
Yeah.
reckoning and stuff like that. So it's but what I find is I'm sure this group is very familiar with the K-shaped economy situation. There's the haves and the have-nots, and ever since the 80s, that disparity has gotten just wider and wider and wider. So what I find with older clients, there's ones that the seniors that have the pensions and have the 401ks, ones, and then there's the ones that don't. They're at the bottom of the K. With younger people, is folks that are companies that are doing equity offerings or matchings or stronger matches or student, different cafeteria type things like we'll pay down your student loan. It's kind of the cycle is kind of repeating back into the mid 70s as companies are relearning that if you need employees, you got to compete for them and you got to offer them something other than salary because the big secret is salary is pretty expensive, and
Hmm.
they'd rather give you a pat on the back or a fruit basket rather than 3% over the cost of living raise, that type of thing. So that type of thing. But then the bottom side of the young people that don't have companies like that, they'll have the student debt. They won't have any inheritances from their folks and stuff like that. So we're perpetuating the K-shaped economy by feeding in new members of the lower part of the K and the higher part of the K, and I don't want to say, but boy, we got to create a class war between the two branches. But I think we have to recognize the numbers, and we have to recognize that we can't forever go to income inequality to where there's just one multi-trillionaire and everybody else is paupers. That's the ultimate direction if you just keep on extending it. So you have to kind of, I saw, I think it was an Economist or something like that, an article of where all the billionaires live. And you would think the US was the only place with billionaires. If you look at China and stuff, like you look at the communist countries and you add up the number of billionaires, it dwarfs the US billionaires. So if you're accused of being a communism, ask that person, what do you mean? What is communism? I don't understand it. How do you get billionaires, in a communist society? So it just you have to kind of, yeah. So it just kind of strikes me. It's a little bit off on a tangent, but basically, yeah, companies are obviously trying to provide the incentives, and that's great. But they'll continue to do more to be competitive. Is what they'll have to do. It's just the supply and demand. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a good transition into the Friday's article on Barron's because that whole K-shaped economy, there are folks who are situated, I would say the baby boomers pretty well in retirement, but the next generation is, the millennials, the Gen Xers are probably okay, but like the millennials, Gen Z, Gen Ys, they have an issue that they're going to deal with, which is their parents or grandparents who are baby boomers are starting to have some medical debt that they or just like medical issues that they're going to have to like deal with. And there was that report that came out from the EBRI that highlighted 3 in 10 Americans are taking on massive debt and draining their personal savings to support their family members. Which is like basically, there's this whole great wealth transfer that everyone talks about, like, oh, the baby boomers are going to move, like, I don't know, what is it, 140 something trillion dollars to the next generation. But then there's this emerging story that a lot of that's going to go to healthcare spending to take care of those, retirees who are living longer. And so like that gets drained, that retirement readiness for those baby boomers gets drained in the healthcare spending. But to the point where their kids are taking on debt to support them. So I don't know. It was a pretty eye opening article to hear about, hey, healthcare spending is going to go up a lot while these baby boomers are transferring wealth, and who's going to take on the debt? It's probably going to be the next generation. It's like, how much more does the next generation have to shoulder?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No. Is Yeah, what we had is after World War II, we had the same debt to GDP ratio. A very unsustainable amount building all that equipment to fight World War II with, and the way society ended up getting out of that is relatively high tax rates for corporations and individuals for a fairly extended period of time. 19 up until around what 1960 something. What was it? The top tax rate, marginal tax rate was 90% if you made $1 million. That paid for a lot of infrastructure. We've got this interstate system that we're still riding on. It built a generation of boomers like me that were able to go to college on a state scholarship and just take on a few dollars worth of debt to pay housing or be able to work at a minimum wage, which was three times in today's dollars or four times than what it was. I mean, you I worked a minimum wage job that there were people raising families of four on that same thing back in the 70s. That's not the case now. So so you, so society built this infrastructure back then, based on taxes. We and that paid the debt. Back in the 70s, to pay the debt, we let inflation do the dirty work. For 3 years, we had 10% plus inflation and stuff like that. So now the next precipice is going to be this debt to GDP ratio. We're about that same tipping point to where I saw an article today that the Treasury is not positioned to be able to handle 6% notes because they're borrowing short term. They
Yeah.
didn't forget, but they don't want to borrow long term because 4.5%, 5% is too high. So they're cheating, and they're not. They're in a debt spiral. So if the bond market decides that 5 or 6% is the going rate, we either have the 1980s all over again, or we have higher taxes or a combination of both. So that to me is the big mystery, of how society as a whole plays it out this time. But it's the medical part of it is, as you I'm sure are aware or have heard, about 50% of like long-term care patients are on Medicaid. They don't, they're tapped out. So the bottom part of the K, that's their plan is to go on Medicaid, one way or the other. The top half, a lot of clients I work with, my average client, nobody's average, but when you look at all my clients and I divide it by number of clients, about $2 million. So if a person's got $2 million, they're in a good self insure that risk kind of mode to where they're probably going to die with $1 million, which is their buffer for the 20% chance that they're going to need memory care for many years and have to spend that down, because they've got that nest egg. So either the kids or the nursing home will get that. But the bottom part of the K, it's going to be a Medicaid situation most likely, that type of thing. Or a lot of families, they rally around and pass the hat until the hat is empty, to try to prevent having to go to a Medicaid facility. So there's a lot of different strategies out there, I guess.
There are, but these are real conversations that folks are starting to
Yeah,
have. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
it's there's the human aspect to it. You don't want your uncle living on the street, right? Because they went into so much debt that the bank had to foreclose on their house and all that stuff. So like these are actually like real conversations, and I don't.
yeah,
It sounds like a lot of families are not prepared. Hell, even the states are not prepared for that.
yeah,
And for folks that don't understand why the debt to GDP is really important. You don't the big picture is you don't want your government not to be able to afford supporting its citizens. That's the big picture. So if debt if the amount that the government borrowed is too expensive for it, then they either have to raise taxes for everybody, which means your pay goes down, or your take home pay goes down, or they have to cut services, which means they'll have to cut the military budget. They have to cut Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, like all these social safety nets, budgets, which means less services for you, which is really scary. Like you don't want to move backwards in society. You want to keep moving forward. So that's why this whole like the Treasury comment that Tom just mentioned is that's pretty Scary to hear.
It, yeah, it's whenever I see articles of that tone, it's sobering because the debt market's bigger than the equity market, right? I think I mean, everybody takes it for granted until it's real, like it was during 2008 situation. Housing. I had trial by fire when I first entered the industry. A couple years later, I had a client, and they said they bought two $700,000 homes with mortgages, one for an investment, one to live in, and they were both worth $350,000.
Oof.
And the bank was asking him to come in for a meeting.
Yeah. All right, so that's our weekly recap.
Yes, yes.
Very, a little sobering in the beginning, little bright spot in the middle, and then a little more sobering at the end. But I do want to talk about our special topic on um, ESG and impact investing across the private channel. So like there was a report I shared with Tom earlier. It was basically this company called Fintrix that did a study, and long story short, its study revealed that the average advisor, planner, wealth manager firm adopted ESG or sustainable investing at basically like 7.2% of all of the independent RAs had adopted sustainable investing as part of their practices. But then when you compared that to the single family offices and the multifamily offices, for folks that don't know what those are basically customized investment advisory shops for either families or individuals who have a lot of money. So somebody that has $25 million or above in liquid assets, they'll usually hire an advisor to work just on their money. Um, and this goes into the billions. So like Jeff Bezos and sure Elon Musk has a family office that works for him directly on his investing. So those family offices adopted sustainable investing, particularly impact investing. And if you took all of them, 26 to 34% had some flavor of that. So 7% for the average client versus 26 to 34% for these like really 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 rich households and families and individual like investors. And that's a pretty big divergence. So a lot of times the single family offices and the multifamily offices are much more resource much less resource constrained than the individual shops like Tom. Like I'm sure you don't have like a $20 million budget, Tom, but these single family offices can have sometimes $100 billion budgets. And it's interesting to see that they are adopting or have adopted impact investing and some flavor of sustainable investing at a much much higher clip. So like does that mean that wealthy individuals, the smart money is basically in sustainable investing than just like the average investment advisory shop? Is that the kind of key takeaway, or is there something else that we're missing here?
Yeah, I don't obviously deal in the family office space. I do have clients that have 25 million, one or two in that area, but they're do-it-yourselfers. They literally they already know what they want. They just need a few hours of conversation to pressure test themselves and stuff like that. But maybe half of my clients do ESG out of the 170 a year of some degree. About 10% go filter down to animal cruelty, vegan investing, if you will, and stuff like this. And why they do it is the dilemma is they're not anything close to traditional impact investing. They can't afford that. They don't have the bandwidth for that, or they just don't have the comfort level or the full awareness of all that entails. But the folks that do it on a retail basis, they intuitively get the idea of that you don't want to have perfect be the enemy of the good. It is they'll come to me with a set of funds that are very familiar in the space, names and stuff like this. They'll come to me that way, or they'll ask, is that a thing? And what I boil it down to, because I'm agnostic, I don't have a particular fund family that I represent or a particular favorite, if you will, is I tell folks that the average advisor is just like me. They can't tell what the stock market's going tomorrow. They probably not really have a clue what's going to happen next year. Otherwise they'd be lying. Who really knows, right? So we're operating with some uncertainty. So there's 100 good ways to invest to kind of not hurt yourself, maybe 100 bad ones. We have to find the good ones. People will say, well, what do you think about, like SpaceX, or, like he asked me 2 weeks ago, asked me now, same answer, but totally different environment, as far as what the prospects look like. Is what I tell folks in my hard experience is that I was a hobbyist. I would try picking stocks with my mad money and stuff like this and have some fun with it as a hobbyist. I grew up and learned that that has to be your play money account. You can have some fun with it, but it's more your entertainment money. Your real money has to have more of a recognition that you don't know the future. And but that doesn't mean it has to be the straight up index with fossil fuels in there, with everybody, with for profit prisons, all the different things in there. You could filter out. You just pick out an approach that is broad enough and for you to not hurt yourself. What I tell folks, and because a lot of folks do like individual stocks, they come to me with individual stocks. I tell them, you know what, I'm not going to, like some advisors, I'm not going to make you sell them because I'm not going to give you a model A, B, C, or D. I'm going to do a custom work and recognize where you are. I find that my go-to expression is that I don't know who the winners are. I've learned the hard way that I can't pick them. 50-50 batting average at best. But as a scientist, I know who the losers are: the fossil fuel industry, the meat industry, the dairy industry. If you look at climate change, where it's going, you could look at the southeast of the United States. There's a tick that it infects you and it makes you allergic to red meat. That doesn't bode well for the meat industry. Not that they needed any more bad news, right?
Mm.
But years ago it was mad cow disease, all this other kind of stuff. The cost of that is going to be just prohibitive. You don't have to be a vegan, you don't have to be a vegetarian. You just have to be an economic actor, and you're going to say, I have to eat affordably.
Yeah.
So I think fossil fuels, 40% of fossil fuel cost is shipping these things through the Strait of Hormuz and everywhere else. That's unsustainable going forward. Electrification, the rest of the world is eating their lunch every day of the week. So I think that is driving individuals to ESG SRI, is that most ESG SRI fund families have those sensitivities to know who the losers are, plus additional losers that they choose. But my niche is to kind of be able to speak to things that are in my comfort level. It's just I know there's 100 different ways to get energy other than fossil fuels.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the lessons that I learned when I was working at my old shop is that stocks move for all sorts of reasons. I mean, like, look at what is it like Exxon right now? It's like half a trillion. It's worth $500 billion, right? And that's under a couple of administrations where fossil fuels were looked down upon. But the stock is still like half a trillion, right? In market cap value. You may not be able to pick a stock and understand exactly what its future is, but if you pay attention to the mega themes, then they give you insights as to where the economy, where the markets are going. So,
Yeah,
AI is a mega theme, right? Or the opioid crisis was a mega theme that you wanted to avoid a number of
yeah,
drug distributors and
yeah,
certain pharmaceutical companies. So I totally hear you on that. And I think that, I think the approach of giving your client what they're asking for is a really smart approach versus, trying to predict what they want. And I think like listening closely and creating a plan for them is probably been very helpful for you amongst your clients. So I really liked your response there, Tom.
right.
The So we're wrapping up the show right now, and I always like to ask my favorite question to my special guest, which is, what are you looking forward to next week?
Okay, yes. Well, I'm going to be. going to the Garrett Planning Annual Conference. It's a conference of mostly hourly fee only financial advisors. It'd be my 22nd year in a row attending. So obviously I like the conference. A lot of great friends and stuff like that. But then when I get back from that, I'll be going to Alaska and taking the Alaska ferry to Ketchikan for like a mini poor man's cruise on a ferry route, a day and a half up the Inside Passage. But actually, I always look forward to coming back home. And I'm not a workaholic. I just love my work. I love my work, and for ever since I did the career change, I haven't. I don't really. It's mission. It's not work. It's just reason for waking up in the morning.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you, Tom, for being our special guest this week on episode 18 of Inside the Flows. It's been wonderful having you and love your insights. And I'm sure our audience members are going to appreciate the ins and outs that you gave them. For folks that are interested in some of the items that Tom talked about, I'll post a link to the 2 books that he had mentioned. And if you are a advisor, planner, wealth manager, family office, single family office, and you want to keep the conversation going, please join us on Inflows. It's free to join and free to use, and we'll be having a conversation there about Tom's episode. So join us there, and we will catch you next week. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Well, and thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your summers.